for South Africa post-COVID-19 and just how things will be brought back to some sense of normality when it comes to South Africa's economy and perhaps rebuilding. Can we get it right? Well, the president has spoken to unions and asked them to perhaps be a part of the solution to all of this. But can they play their part? Are they even in touch with what the president has said? Are they in agreement? We spoke to Cosatu earlier. Let's speak to Cosatu now. The Deputy Parliamentary Coordinator, Matthew Parks, joins us as well right now. Matthew, thank you so much for the time. The president's address offering little by way of new elements. Do you get a sense that you could be, form part of the coalition to build on what he has made note of?
Well, yes, in fact, we have been part of it. It was Cosatu which drafted the initial economic recovery plan proposals in October last year. Most of our proposals with our other sister federations, Fedusa and NACTU, were discussed at extensive engagements at NEDLAC with government business. And as the president mentioned now, that by and large, the NEDLAC economic recovery plan discussions have formed the basis of what he has announced today. So we largely welcome it. I think most of us can agree as government, as business, as labor, what needs to be done to fix the economy. What are the problems? I think for us as Cosatu, what is really critical is, can government rebuild its capacity to implement what we've agreed on, what the president has announced? Can the private sector inject the resources, the stimulus into the economy to grow it? Those for us are the critical issues. But again, we can have all the wonderful plans on the table. Government has to deal with corruption and wasteful expenditure, because no matter how much money you mobilize, no matter how many plans and programs you put in place, unless we deal with our demons of corruption and wasteful expenditure, we're not going to be addressing the fundamental challenges facing us. So there's much of what the president said today that we agreed to. The ESCOM social compact that we drafted as Cosatu has finally been agreed to by other trade unions, by business, by by government. We now must move to implementation. So yes, there's much we agreed to, but I think the results will be in government implementing and private sector contributing towards the financial resources.
How does government increase capacity then?
Sure. The simplest thing is simply to deal with corruption and wasteful expenditure. According to the Auditor General's reports, we lose about 150 billion rand every year in the state. That's 15 times the amount of money that SAA requires. That's a huge amount of cash we could save. So it has to do with firing corrupt politicians, making sure that management who have stolen are arrested, that the assets are confiscated. We have to ensure that the government spends money as it is meant to be spent. We acknowledge that in the past decade, there's been a huge hollowing out of the state, and it is going to take some time to rebuild. Government is making some initial positive steps in rebuilding the leadership of the law enforcement agencies, but it really needs to be escalated. I think you've seen some initial green shoots at ESCOM where some managers were suspended. There's been some recovering of the stolen assets. So those are the kind of things we're talking about, but it needs to be ramped up massively. But I think also government on its own will never have enough money to rebuild the economy.
Yeah.
The road maintenance backlog is about 600 billion rand. Government never had that kind of money to invest in it. So the private sector needs to really come to the party in a way it has never come to the party before.
Yeah.
The president mentioned the credit guarantee scheme, which has been distributed at a snail's pace. So we need to see the banks really releasing cash into this economy.
Matthew, do you think then that perhaps the reason why the banks, or even the private sector, as you made note of there, hasn't necessarily invested in South Africa's economy as you'd perhaps like, is because there's still too much political interference in all these aspects, whereas if strategic partners were found for certain SOEs, if government became more an administrator of services more than an owner of particular services, that perhaps would create an environment that would allow the private sector to get involved in. Is that perhaps a hindrance?
Look, I think there's many obstacles to economic growth, and I think some of them the president has alluded to. Reducing the regulatory obstacles for business to set up. For example, the delays in water licensing make it easier to set up a company. But of course, also equally central to getting businesses to move is to ensure we have a reliable and affordable electricity supply. That's the number one issue. It's about tackling corruption and wasteful expenditure. It's about ensuring municipalities provide decent roads, access to water, access to sanitation. It's about making sure law enforcement does what it's paid to do. So there are many issues. But again, the private sector also has to contribute. We acknowledge there are many problems. The SOEs themselves have to be put back onto a sound financial footing. They must stop being a burden to the state and an obstacle to economic growth. But again, the private sector has to play its part. Government must do its bit, but the private sector also has to come to the party because they've got the huge financial resources. So yes, they've made many proposals which we've agreed to around data, around internet connectivity, around making it easier to do business. But again, they must also play the part. And it is quite disturbing that during this lockdown, the 200 billion rand credit guarantee scheme, we've had to harass the banks, the private sector to really unlock it. So there's so much government can do, but again, the private sector has to now come to the party in a way it's never come before.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you just one final question, and maybe, I don't know, maybe this one is a little far too technical. Even in my head, it sometimes gets a little bit mind-boggling, Matthew. But should we have created the loan guarantee scheme to begin with? Not because that wouldn't have, we don't want to give money out to people, but because we're creating a loan society. So we're giving loans out to people. We're not actually stimulating the economy. We're creating more debt in an economy that is already struggling. Should we have perhaps rethought that, do you think?
Look, hindsight is always 20/20, and the system's not perfect. But the number one thing we must do is to save every single job, to save every single company we can. That is the number one objective. We need to do as the US has done, as Europe, as Russia, as China, Korea, Singapore have done, just throw every possible tool, resource, intervention we can at the economy. Other things we can fix later, but we have to save as many companies and as many jobs as possible. So this loan guarantee scheme is part of that. It's the largest part of the stimulus plan right now. And the fact is the banks have to make it more accessible. They have to make credit more affordable. Not in a reckless way, definitely, but they need to show some creativity and some imagination and some patriotism. We think that we need to go a bit further. As you're saying, you can't simply have debt because many companies will say, I can't afford more debt because I'll never be able to pay it back. We think it should be a hybrid system that, yes, you give loan, but you convert some of that loans to grants in condition for companies staying open, number one, but saving jobs and make it incentivized to create new jobs. So have a mixed approach, which the US has done, which Europe has done. But look, number one, again, is about saving all our jobs and all our companies. Yeah. We can't afford to push unemployment any further. We can't afford to close any more businesses.
Yeah. Matthew Parks, appreciate the time. Thank you so much. Cosatu Parliamentary Coordinator there, joining us then via video link. Appreciate your time as well then this afternoon.